Welcome, everyone. This is the Oromo Studies Association Scholars Conversation. The purpose of this conversation series is to bring scholars to discuss on timely issues related to our people, generally also in the Horn of Africa. And for today, we have selected the political ecology of war and famine in the Horn of Africa, with Oromia in focus. We have selected this because it is a very timely topic. It is a serious topic because, as many of you know, famine is a looming and a disastrous phenomena in the region. According to the UN report, very recently, nearly 29 million people are in urgent need of food aid in Ethiopia, in general parts of Ethiopia, out of which 9.9 million are in pastoralist areas of the region. And we also selected this topic because in most diplomatic, humanitarian, and even scholarly reports, there is a tendency of underrepresentation and disconnection and depoliticization of the factors and actors of this problem. That means, in most of the cases, humanitarian organizations, diplomatic actors, and even policymakers depoliticize it and then associate that as the natural cause, as caused by either drought or other natural factors. However, critical scholars in the fields of political ecology, in the fields of political economy, and other critical scholarship strongly associate that famine is often politically produced and constructed for the purpose of punishing or controlling societies. This has been there in history. This has been going on under different successive imperial and colonial regimes in different parts of Africa and different parts of the world, and under successive regimes in Ethiopia. Therefore, to this end, in order to unveil the entanglement of the complex entanglement of the political, ecological, or environmental, security, and other strategic factors and actors involved in this process, in the process of in these problems related to war, famine, and other humanitarian crises in the region, two distinguished scholars will be joining me today to discuss on this topic. The first one is Professor Gufu Oba, a distinguished professor who has extensively researched and published on issues related to pastoralism, pastoralist resilience, social capital, conflict, cross-border relations, and so on. And one particular book that interested me under the title Nomads in the Shadows of Empires. This book illustrates the plights of pastoralist societies in the frontiers of empires, that is the colonial empire, the colonial system in Kenya, and the imperial system in Ethiopia. And the book also gives us insight about how pastoralist communities and different marginalized societies suffer under authoritarian and dictatorial systems because of restriction from access to resources. He extensively published on the area, as I mentioned before, and then he will be a serious and important asset to our discussion today. The second panelist joining me today is our colleague, Dr. Gutu Olana from the University of Helsinki in Finland. Dr. Gutu has researched and published on issues of displacement, dispossession, land expropriation, and resource governance. He also worked on issues related to large-scale land appropriation, which led to impoverishment of different societies in different parts of the world, particularly in Oromia. So thank you, both of you, for joining me. Thank you for accepting my request. Now we proceed with this discussion for nearly an hour. And it is, as I mentioned before, it is a free scholarly conversation where we exchange ideas from a scholarly perspective. The first entry points which I want to raise, particularly to Professor Gufu Oba, is you researched much from the historical perspective related to pastoralist societies in the Horn of Africa. And you, in your books, you mentioned that hegemonic systems like the colonial Kenya and the imperial Ethiopia, and even since then, since the decolonization period in Kenya and also under different regimes in Ethiopia, pastoral societies have been subjected to marginalization, not because they don't have resources, but because they are technically and systematically subjected to restrictions. Restriction from access to resources, restriction from mobilities, restriction even to their knowledge. A different knowledge system has been imposed, and that led them to be vulnerable to even climate change, and that reduces their resilience. That is what you have been arguing. Would you just take us back to history and then bring us to the current crisis in the region, how state systems have been subjecting these societies into such vulnerabilities? Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Sebe. I want to put this discussion into historical context, as you suggested. And I want to give some general backgrounds in the first place. First of all, considering that the region we are talking about is the Horn of Africa, that includes Ethiopia, Somalia, and much of northern Kenya. This region can be classified as a focal point of conflict, famine, and wars over several centuries. Predates even colonial periods. There has always been conflicts of various kinds. We do not need to lose this particular aspect. I want to focus, it is generally common, and many people who are not in academic areas want to discuss contemporary events more than historical events. But by drawing on historical events, I think we learn more, trying to understand how societies in this particular region, be it Oromo, Somalis, or any other pastoral groups, deal with these disasters that I call disasters jointly. That includes wars, famine, droughts, epidemics, and so on. I want to put this into historical context, as I said, that societies have knowledge of the past. And that's why history is important for us to draw on. Is the current calamities experienced by the societies linked to the inability of the societies to be able to adapt, or their adaptive systems were disabled because of superimposed powers by states, for example, by drawing up of international borders that limits movements that were traditionally practiced. Every society has a system of social memory that is passed from one generation to the other regarding the impacts of droughts, the predictabilities of drought and famine and wars, and its impact on the pastoral economy and the environment. I want to draw on the southern region of Ethiopia and the northern Kenya, the regions which I am familiar with more. But this would also apply to much of the Horn of Africa, particularly the Ogadenia region and part of Somalia. And many of these pastoral societies have actually some encyclopedic knowledge of the past. And this past knowledge, which of course few individuals and elders have orally passed on from one generation to the other, has been the basis to help these societies to adapt to disasters. So it is not true to say that drought or wars are new phenomena. They are actually historical phenomena. If we use the Oromo as an example, the Oromos have a system of social memory. They have what we now know as the Gada system. The Gada system, in actual fact, is a library that contains within it several things, not only cultural, but the storage of knowledge. And we know that each Gada system comprises 5 generations. And for the active Gada, like the Guji and the Borana, this is well known. It has been going on for several centuries. These 5 generations, each in turn, return to power after 8 years, but each generation returns to power after 40 years. So the Borana Oromo, for that reason, record event histories that occurred during each generation class. And each generation class, therefore, is associated with particular events that had occurred throughout history and that will continue to occur in future. And there are different terminologies that are used. They use 2 kinds of systems. One is the generation class that returns to power after 40 years. That each generation is 5 years, and then the same generation class comes back after 40 years. Then there is another cycle called the naming of the generation class, which is called Makbas. The Makbas cycles combined with the generation class cycles last 208 returns with 280 years. These 280 years coincide with the return of every generation class to power. So subsequently, what happened about 280 years in a particular generation class returns after that kind of period. These inevitable returning events, which are known among the Borana Oromo as Aichi, is an inevitable event that occurs. For example, I will use some examples here. The present Gada says the Gada Abagada in Borana is the return of the generation during 1891, 1890s, if you want to call it that way. Now that Gada was associated with epidemics, rinderpest, when the society was totally decimated. The population crashed, the demographic of human societies crashed, livestock populations crashed, and the few societies that survived dispersed among other societies. Now the Borana think that the present Abagada is the return of that event, although the cause is not epidemics, but the drought and the famine effect had similar, that this society has lost so much livestock. And many people, were it not for international organizations, could have been famine, dying because of famine. So this actually, the return, inevitable return of events is really a construction by the Borana society, which helps them to kind of gauge what will happen in the future. It is inevitable, and they know it, that it will happen. Now, the traditional, therefore, the way the societies deal with these disasters be it drought, famine, and so on, is to kind of use the post-events, the post-drought or post-famine events, as a period of reconstruction, social reconstruction, because societies break up. So there must be some capacities to reconstruct and reconstitute systems of assistance for supporting each other. So when we look at this in historical example, I want to use an example here, and I want to share a scheme. Let me see. Can I share a diagram? It says disabled.
Yeah, let me put you as yeah, you can do that.
Okay. Now let's use this example of this particular figure. And this is a figure from my new book, which will come out in Palgrave Macmillan. And the book is called Managing Resilience in Northeast Africa. Now, looking at the Borana society and the Gada system, it shows that this society has been exposed to various kinds of disaster events, be it drought or famine and wars, from 16th century, that is from 1500 to the present. Therefore, we are able to know exactly what happened to this society during these different periods. So during the peri-colonial period, there were famine and wars, and the societies used their indigenous adaptive system to survive after the disasters are gone. And that includes even disasters such as the rinderpest epidemic of the late 19th century. But then these internal capacities of the societies were broke down following encompassing that encapsulation by political power, the colonial powers of this society, and that the Borana or the Oromos were split between Ethiopia and Kenya by international borders. And because of border politics, the society's movements were restricted during this particular period. But then the politics of the empires did not stop droughts or famine or even wars, but rather intensified the effects of these events, which the society would have used different methodologies or adaptive methods to survive. So the indigenous systems of adaptations were disabled during colonial period. And I come quickly to the period of 1960s and 70s, which you will know that there was the Ethiopian-Somali-Ogaden War, and in Kenya, we had what is called shifter secessionist war, and then there has been continuous banditry across this frontier for that period of time. This was a major devastation to the societies. Remember, there has been so many wars in countries such as Ethiopia that are well recorded by Richard Pankhurst, for example. And we have stories going back to Mohammed Garan, for which a book actually exists. And we know that the majority of the people who involved in these wars are pastoralists. But no one has in detail analyzed the aftermath of impacts of wars on pastoral societies. You can think of the Ogaden. The only knowledge we have about this period is mass displacement and refugees. That kind of is spilled over across borders, national borders and international borders. And that is the consequence of wars. Displacement means disabling indigenous systems of adaptation in totality, impoverishment of the populations. In Kenya, what happened was pastoralism ended. And the Borana refer to this as Gafdaba. Gafdaba means it's the period of stop. Everything is stopped. Livestock died, people were displaced, and they were squeezed into small security places. Currently, in the region of southern Ethiopia, in the region of Liba and Negele Borana, the Borana who occupied different places were pulled together into what is called security centers. These security centers, they enjoyed these places with their livestock, but the livestock have nothing to graze. So even before drought came, the livestock started dying. So the consequence of the state in trying to combat warfare, for example, secessionist war or war like the one which is going on in Ethiopia currently, and or that which occurred in northern Kenya during 1960s, is to crawl up all the residents into secure areas, not taking into account that these people needed mobility for their livestock to survive. That means after the end of the conflict, the society can no longer be able to survive on pastoralism. They must be able to find other ways. So there are some transformative processes that would occur. And the societies, of course, have internal mechanisms of reorganization and transformation, and this involves use of land. And in southern Ethiopia, what happened was that people were moved from all the grazing areas, remote grazing areas, enhanced conflicts between ethnic groups that were not resident of the region, but who now currently occupy the region from which the Boran were displaced. And then moving the society along highways. If you go to southern Ethiopia now, you find all the settlements strung along the highways all the way to Yaballo. And the same in Kenya, majority of the former nomads have now moved into towns, and that the rangelands, which are diminishing because of enclosing. Individuals are enclosing now. Instead of communal rangelands, now individuals are enclosing private pastures. This means that the system is likely to break down as we knew them in historical times. So I do not want to there's a lot of material on this say, but go and take much of the time. But we see here a very strong interaction between politics, environment, and that environment has always an overarching effect. Whether we are under imperial system or colonial system, the environmental forces have always been effective or active. Now, it actually means that when you superimpose on that traditional system, colonial control or imperial control, or even the present post-colonial control, it means that the societies lose the flexibility that they have had in the past, and therefore affecting them, that whenever disasters that naturally would occur, it has physical, socio-economic, and political dimensions that need to be discussed. It affects sources of food, diminishes resources which societies depend on, and also these limited resources might be the cause of conflict in certain cases, like is happening in northern Kenya, for example, in some parts of northern Kenya. Wars are even more terrible, although greater details have not come out because of lack of research on impacts of wars on indigenous societies. You can think of Second World War, all the bombs which the Italians threw down onto the Ogaden region and other parts of Ethiopia, including Borana, for example, mustard gas, and so on. Presently, and in Eritrea, and the regions of Eritrea, where there has been wars and Ethiopians who are bombing that region. Currently, Ethiopia and the Tigrayans are fighting. So many, there's more weapons in the region and a lot of fighting is going on. So these bombed regions and the firepower, the tanks and all these are actually taking place in places where they are pastoral, like in the Afar and the Afar region for that matter. So pastoralists are directly affected, but no one has examined the consequences, the long-term, the short-term and long-term consequences of these wars on pastoral society. In Kenya, we are a little bit lucky because we have had the PhD students and myself, we have studied this for quite a bit of time. And some other studies have actually been conducted that looked at the long-term impacts of wars on pastoral societies. Finally, I want to say that this topic is pertinent, and sorry to have taken a lot of time of Gutu, who was my my former student also. And I am sure with the contemporary dimensions, he would be able to enrich this introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. You really gave us also the dimension that particularly important is how state interventions of different kinds, either through war or through so-called development interventions, development policies, destroy the capacity, indigenous capacities of different societies, whether it is farmers or pastoralists. That is what we are also observing in different parts of the country, in different parts of the region. I will come back to Dr. Gutu with particular focus that a kind of building on what Professor Oba has said, how different state policies of intervention, whether through land expropriation, where you also did your many of your research, land expropriation from farmers or from pastoralists, or restriction of access to resources, whether because of security issues or using that environmental or ecological spaces as strategic locations where the state wants to control society. How does that, taking any examples that you have, how does that also exacerbates vulnerability of societies, either farming societies from producing and then sustaining their lives, or how that does that make pastoralist communities also vulnerable to these natural disasters like drought? Please, Dr. Gutu.
Thank you, Dr. Asebe, for inviting me for this timely and important event. I would also like to share my pleasure for sharing this panel with my professor, former Professor Gufu Oba. It is glad to be here. Let me start by briefly connecting this broader concept or topic of war and famine to the notion of political ecology, whereby I would like to emphasize the combination of politics and ecology, the way Professor Gufu has already mentioned. Political ecology obviously combines politics and ecology, but some of the things that we call political are not always evidently on the surface to be seen as political. Sometimes authorities would like to actually obscure things that are political as if they are technical, which James Ferguson actually calls it rendering technical. So it is important to look into political ecology as a field that seeks to understand the complex relationship between society and environment. Within this society, of course, the state comes in with its own power, which actually shifts or manipulates the overall dynamics. Saying this, issues of access to resources and control over resources of all kinds are always political. They are, of course, also political economic questions. In that sense, political ecology, not to dwell on the concept, political ecology actually combines political economy, broadly speaking, and ecology as pertaining to the environment. Then analysis of any access to resources, whether it is about land transactions, land grabbing, or absolute control of land by the state, for example, across regimes in Ethiopia, it should be placed in a context of broader society environment relations and the very definition of political ecology. State-people relations, which is now again as Professor Gufu said, war and famine is not new, but it manifests itself in greater or lesser scale across time. Despite regime change across the Ethiopian state, for example, we have seen maintained some sort of central state-people relations, whereby the state are excluded from all sorts of decision-making as far as governing their resources is concerned. Now, what is imposed from above is not only state's desire or control on the people or on their resources, but also claim of knowledge or knowing for the people. Like, for example, as Professor Gufu alluded to, even trying to propagate or at least represent pastoralism as an inefficient resource management mechanism, as something that need to be changed. And policies of sedentarization, for example, which has actually affected pastoral communities in different ways, has been propagated by regime after regime in the context of Ethiopia, if you look at the southern Oromia region, for example. So contestations and negotiations over control and access to resources sometimes manifests itself in terms of war, and the consequences of war are obviously devastating. And again, that also shapes subsequent state-society relationships. Now, let me talk into the implications of what happens when people are excluded from decision-making concerning resource governance. They will be at the mercy of whatever the state does, okay, on their behalf. Now, we are talking about the state or governments after governments, actually, regimes after regimes in the context of Ethiopia have never, in my view, that is my point of view, have never fairly represented the people across the country. There is no fair representation. In the absence of representation, the state or the government that claims to represent the people decides on behalf of the people, and the people live the consequences of those decisions, whether it is displacement, being displaced when the land is given to certain investors, for example, whether it is actually being cut off humanitarian aids when aid is required in certain localities, on different claims. For example, in the context of war, this is happening in Tigray. This is happening in Oromia to a lesser extent, as far as denying aid, basic services to people. So inability, now people operating in this context would find it difficult to produce food for their subsistence, let alone for commercial or surplus. They would find it difficult to produce enough food. Productivity would drastically reduce, and in this context, one has to look into the politics of scale, and that is also where political ecology is an important tool to investigate these questions of famine and war. Because what happens in a specific locality, whether it is in the southern Oromia, in Borana area, in Borana Guji, in western part of Oromia, in Wallagga, it is not that local, in a sense that it has been influenced by extra local structural and political economic forces, and political ecology actually helps us to investigate and look into those issues critically. I don't know if I have adequately addressed your point, but let me say this. People-environment relations, people's access to resources, and the process of deciding who has access and who is denied access, all is shaped by wider political and economic structural forces. In fact, if we look into possibilities of resolving current crisis of war and famine. We also need to recognize the political, economic, and structural factors that go beyond the localities of focus. That is actually a turn away, a departure from the original conception of political ecology, where the focus was on localities to wider structural factors. I will come back in later time.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Gutu. Before I take to the point to Professor Oba, I again want to build on your point, Gutu, bringing directly to the current crisis in Oromia because of the adequate insights that you have, and also building on the points that you said, that this politics of denial about the existence of the problem and also about the cause of that problem is fundamentally a critical issue that we are observing in Oromia. For example, the famine, the humanitarian crisis in different parts of Oromia, beginning from Borana, Guji, Hararge, Bale, anywhere, and even in western part of Oromia. Not to mention this and that, it is entirely, there are different, the hidden famine is going on, but the states, the Ethiopian government, and specifically also the regional state of Oromia are denying, one, its existence, and secondly, they are also externalizing that cause as drought and something. So if you, but from different sources, what we know is because of the existence of violence, state violence, conflict, and the war in Oromia, for example, people are not accessing the resources that they have. Mobilities are restricted. Pastoralists could not move from place to place because of the war. Farmers are not able to farm on their plots of land because they are either the productive group, the youth, are they migrated to the urban areas because the rural areas are now becoming very risky for them. They would be alleged that they are supporting this or that. So if you also bring that and how this conflict and the violence in Oromia is exacerbating the famine, and why is that also hidden? Yeah, Gutu.
Thank you, Dr. Sabe, again. Now, people do need productive, some sorts of capital to engage in productive activities. And beyond that, beyond the resources that they need, they also need peace and security, the ability to farm, to cultivate their land is greatly hampered in Western Oromia, if you take for the last 3 years. And now this has been expanding to other Oromia regions of Oromia, other areas of Oromia as well. People do not feel secure. They don't feel, in most parts, they don't feel they have that security to engage in productive activities, whether it is farming, whether it is pastoralism, because there is a great risk of not even being secured once you are out of your house. And in fact, this current policy of the scorched earth policy of the states in Ethiopia also is pretty much taken to a higher level, whereby people's houses are burned down and people have no place, no secure place to hide. And the productive force, the youth who could produce, who could engage in productive activities, are most of the time targeted by the state. For that reason, there is also a clear indication that the youth are joining armed forces, including in Oromia, for example. Now, okay, you said already in the beginning that famine is not something natural. Even okay, we can even say drought could recur once in a while. That could be debated whether drought could be somehow man-made or not. But the consequences of drought, if it becomes famine, then it is not really natural. So it is centrally political. So what I would like to emphasize here is that drought is probably natural, that there is lack of rain could be considered natural at some level. Even that could be debated. But famine, extreme scarcity of food, is not, especially in current context of the world, where the world could help out before certain impending disaster or famine hits certain population. If that happened, that is actually political. Political in terms of its cause, especially when reinforced by ongoing war, as it is a case in Ethiopia, for example, which is intertwined with government policies, and also it is political relating to its consequences and relating to government's policy. Now, how does the government respond when drought happens in a certain area? Even when starvation starts to hit people, when people are dying, is it reported? Are media free to report those kind of incidences in Ethiopia? By not helping the victims, by hiding the facts on the ground, and by silencing those who speak against this, and by altogether denying the existence of starvation or famine or even drought in certain instances. And this is also a pattern. If we look back into history, the imperial regime denied the existence of starvation in the 70s. The socialist regime of Mengistu denied in the beginning again. No authoritarian state is willing to expose that people are dying of starvation, lack of food. And this has repeated itself during the era of Prosperity Party in the last couple of years. We know what is going on internally and inside the Prosperity Party officials in terms of exposing and not exposing those incidents, for example, in Guji area. So to deny is to ignore or assume that something has never happened and propagate a different scenario. It is also another way of misrepresenting or omitting certain facts while saying or exposing only parts of it. Now, this is a bottom line. If we do not recognize, if we do not expose a problem exists and work towards its solution, there is little chance that there would be resolution. Let me stop here. Thank you, Asabe.
Yeah, thank you, Guto, very much. You underscored that the politics of denial, for the purpose of politics, either to externalize that or even to silence those who are speaking, and also to punish people through starvation. That is what we are also observing in Tigray, in western part of Oromia, in southern part of Oromia, and so on. So using starvation and the famine as a political instrument is what is going on in Ethiopia. This is the bottom line, and what you also underscored. Let me be back to Professor Oba with the broader implication. Now we are talking about the war. The war is not only what is going on in Oromia, but also in the region in broader sense. We can take Somalia, we can take what is going on in Tigray, in Oromia entirely, and then and also linked to this, the famine which is going on, which affects people, which displaces or forces people to be displaced. What is the implication of this on the regional security of the Horn of Africa? And how could this be, broadly speaking, at a kind of diplomatic, political level addressed to the international community, for example? You are muted, Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Sebe. It is quite obvious to many of us that wars, in particular, have the effect of approaching societies. And a good example has been the regions of Congo, Zaire, the former Zaire, the present-day Congo, South Sudan, and Somalia. The region, many of their population are displaced as refugees in Kenya. So Kenya has a very important experience about this. Now, these societies who are displaced and become refugees in hundreds of thousands, who are traditionally taking care of their own affairs. They were responsible for looking after their livelihoods, managing their resources, and so on. Now, once the war came and they were uprooted, be it ethnic groups or government, direct or indirect impacts on their welfare systems, and they were displaced. So they ran away for safety. So I think there is no comparison for existence of peace compared to as a solution to finding solution to famine situations and displacement of societies. In Kenya, we have a lot of experience. I was, for example, as a young school-going student, knew this period of Daba, which is to stop, which the society called it to stop. It meant that the whole society was kept within 5 kilometers of security centers. Security centers are areas where there existed armed forces and police forces and irregular forces and so on, that they were able to keep the society safe. But in fact, what they did was on suspicion that the society is also aiding resistance against the government. And that is precisely what is happening in Ethiopia, particularly in the regions of Oromia, where from the media we read that many individuals are not only killed, but their properties are burnt and their crops are destroyed and their houses are burnt, and the government is silent on this. It also happened in Kenya that during the period of the Shifta War, for example, the government was never vocal on the impacts of this warfare on society. The societies lost their livestock either to machine gunning by the state forces or looting by the guerrillas, and at the end of the day, they became impoverished. So the famine, therefore, as Dr. Gutu mentioned, it is politically enforced. The main trigger could have been something else, but you see that one they would have survived using their adaptive strategies. But now the traditional adaptive strategies are broken down. For Oromia, I think this is even more critical because this is the region that produces food for Ethiopia. And if there's no peace in the Oromia region, it means the rest of the Ethiopian populations would starve because actually food would not be produced. A lot of young people would have joined the army or joined guerrillas, and the rest are not safe. And that creates a scenario which is very harmful to the society in the long term. We went through this. But the The long-term impact is perhaps the most severe one. And in northern Kenya, we do see this long-term impact. You can think of head-on collision by two vehicles, one coming from opposite sides, both of them coming from opposite sides. If the occupants survive at all, their future would be totally changed. And that is exactly what happened to pastoral societies in northern Kenya. Their future changed, and the society had to readjust to different systems of survival. And that is precisely what is, and this is very difficult to reverse, because the government or development agencies do not encourage people going back to traditional nomadism. They would rather be happy that these pastoralists go into urban or peri-urban environments. Under that situation, they become more vulnerable than before, because their traditional coping mechanisms are weakened tremendously. So I think the point for most governments, and that includes Ethiopia, is to find peace. Peace is the ultimate, I think, for these societies. Wars should not exist at all if it can be avoided. But we can see the damage the wars does, and those leaders who do not think that wars are damaging to the societies and the countries are probably would have themselves to blame, and their lives or their future is perhaps, I don't think they have a long way to lead. You cannot lead a famine population or population that human security is reduced. And a good example is Somalia. Somalia is a failed state because of internal and external warfare. That society has, for the last 20 years, has been not possible to rebuild it again for it to secure. Presently, the present government is being kind of supported by external forces from East African countries, and Kenya included, and Ethiopia for that matter included. But Al-Shabaab are bombing their cities even now. So they are unlikely to form a stable system in the future because of this devastated situation, political situation as it is. So the implication is that the long-term impact, you can think of how many refugees have crossed international borders and gone into flimsy boats and drowned in the seas, in the Mediterranean and other sea water bodies, Red Sea and Mediterranean seas. And that is because of lack of human security in their homes. A country that produces human security instead of peace is not a country that can be able to sustain itself. Unfortunately, Ethiopia is one of those countries which never had peace, actually. If you read the history of Ethiopia, which I am familiar with, Ethiopia at no one time had a peaceful situation. They cannot manage peace. They manage war, but not peace. And that's very unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also want to underline what you mentioned now at the end. Ethiopia's history is a history of war, and it has never managed peace but war. So that is also the critical problem that we are confronting. And you mentioned very important point that there is a broader international implication of such humanitarian crisis in the region. For one, Ethiopia, particularly Oromia, is the food producing region, even for Ethiopia, and even could be beyond. And when Oromia starves, when the people in Oromia starve, it is not only those people who suffer, but the entire country. And that leads to the war plus the drought plus the violence and the starvation, consequently leads to broader migration, refugees, and so on, which had its implication not only in the Horn of Africa but beyond. Let me bring back to Gutu. Gutu, you might either expand also on this about the implication of this crisis, but another point I want you to elaborate is also, we mentioned about peace, but in this politics of denial, what should different actors, the international humanitarian organizations, international human rights organizations, governments, and even specifically the Oromo people also, whether politicians or activists, medias, what is expected from different actors in this politics of denial, first to expose, and second to also save the life of millions of people? Go to please.
Thank you again. Before I directly move to this point that you mentioned, let me say a couple of sentences on the difficulties of actually surviving and producing enough for livelihood in a context of war, for example, in a context where people cannot really engage in activities of all kinds, where there is no security. And when disasters hit, as Professor Gufu already mentioned earlier, people have traditionally have certain ways of assisting themselves. And whether those institutions were supported or strengthened, or in some contexts banned by the state, as seen as something that works against the control of the state, is very important. And the history of Ethiopia, with the expansion of the Abyssinian kingdom to the south, the banning of the operations, practices related to the Geda system, which Professor Gufu mentioned, which is actually a repository of knowledge and dealing with environment in many ways, is very important. And then what has been disrupted is, or what has been misrecognized or has been dismantled, is also the knowledge claim of these indigenous peoples. Now, one way to deal with that issue is to reclaim that in all ways possible. And reclaiming that also means contesting the imposed knowledge system in a very constructive way, by empowering the local traditional knowledge systems as it fits the modern society. And in that sense, I would like to cite Gammachuu Magarsa's and Anessa Kassam's 2019 publication about the sacred knowledge of the Oromo of the Horn of Africa, whereby they focus on the Oromo theory of rounds of development, and they mention a very important aspect of productive capital that people need to engage in all kinds of livelihood activities. Finna nama, or sanyi nama, which is human social capital. Finna hori, sanyi hori, economic capital, they say. That also actually, for me, extends over to natural capital in a sense. Finna lafa, pertaining to land, can be related to natural capital. Finna duri, cultural capital, which also includes the knowledge system, traditional knowledge system. And finna bara is temporal factors, whereby people take into account what the current time provides and what could be done in order to survive under the prevailing circumstance. Let me say that and move on to your question, or at least what should be done in broader sense in order to address the current calamities, disasters of war and famine. Now, this is an urgent matter, a matter of urgency, which does not give time. So I would like to call all concerned bodies towards a holistic outlook of the prevailing problems, holistic outlook, and a comprehensive reach. Okay, by reach, I also mean the geography of the aid, for example, providing aid wherever it is needed. And that is a matter of urgency and what should be done. But that is not a solution, a lasting solution that would bring peace. For that reason, more political, more historical look of the political history of the region we are dealing with, given it is the war and famine history of Ethiopia in particular, that needs a comprehensive critical look into the historical processes for solutions to come by. I also would like to emphasize the differentiated nature of the impacts war and famine impose on people. Societies are affected, different sectors of society are differently affected by these phenomena. And that should be seen along ethnic lines, gender lines, class, age, and so on. And I think this is evident to humanitarian organizations as well. But what should be emphasized is also the intersectional nature of the different dimensions, social differentiation angles that I just referred to. Now, this is a big attempt, but still, because it is a pending, it is not yet resolved, addressing the absence of binding legal obligations internationally. For example, what do you do when a state denies food to certain parts of a country? What can internationally be done? And this has been a long-standing problem, and that is still present and something that we cannot ignore. So exposing human rights violations of all kinds under all circumstances, especially in context of war and famine, are very important. International community and political forces, meanwhile, and the people should be attempting to resolve the political ecological crisis, in this case concerning war and famine, by seeking political solutions to fundamental political problems, questions, which are still being denied by those in power, by ruling classes in Ethiopia, for example. That said, this requires considering the political history of Ethiopia and recognizing the prevailing problems, rather than attempting to gloss over those problems through empty promises of prosperity or other sorts of development jargons, which will keep far removing possibilities of peace and prosperity itself. Thank you, Asaba.
Thank you, Gutu. Thank you very much. You mentioned very fundamental points related to the solutions at different levels, from the urgent humanitarian need, where international humanitarian organizations or local humanitarian organizations should also step in and reach to the needy. But the challenge is still is that when the state by itself is controlling access, that would remain a challenge. But you at least mentioned that this is the responsibility of international organizations, and also human rights organizations should expose and work on the violations, because this is violation of human rights. People have the right to get access to food, access to life. I mean, they have the right for life. And the fundamental problem of this famine, as we mentioned at the beginning, is it is politically constructed. Because although there are droughts in history, when states disempower people from their productive capacities by restricting access to resources, or by removing them from their ancestral lands, or by making them vulnerable through war and a conflict, then that is how starvation and the famine is produced. So thank you for that. I will be back to, before I summarize, I will be back to Professor Oba for just if you would give us your comments on what should different actors, the same question, what should different actors do in addressing this crisis? This is a crisis of war and famine in the region broadly. What's your recommendation?
Well, I think simply put, the central focus for any country is, I mean, there are internal events and external events. If wars are related to external factors, one would justify to kind of protect the integrity of national states and stopping the external aggression. But when wars become internal, that the state spends so much money to fight its own citizens, be it that these people have kind of dissenting voices, then the state would be said to have failed. Because nowhere in history, particularly in recent years, have states succeeded in subjugating its population. One has to learn lessons from states that have been peaceful for at least a number of years. Kenya is an example. Kenya is a very open country and has been peaceful since the 1960s from the wars, for example. But internal conflicts between ethnic groups continue on daily basis. But that has not made the state to kind of fight its own citizens. So the central point really is for any country to look for peaceful means to allow its citizens to produce and to live sustainably, not to be interfered with. Because without the state supporting local communities, then the local communities lose the power and the capacity to kind of take care of themselves. Finally, what would happen to population of wars? These individuals will have to rely on the same state to survive. But now the worst thing is that the state is denying existence of these problems in the first place. Famine is denied, and we know what happened to Haile Selassie when Wollo, the region of Wollo, was suffering famine. It failed. And if you look at history of many governments, be it in Europe or across Asia, a government that kind of denied existence of famine impacts on its own population do not succeed. And my urge is actually that the regional states in the Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya, and Djibouti and others, and Eritrea for that matter, is to kind of cultivate peaceful means of survival and not to disenfranchise its populations. The case of the Tigray situation is a tragedy in human history. The case of the Oromo people in Western Oromia and Southern Oromia is another tragedy that is building up. And the state of Ethiopia would have really done itself a big justice. And it is a country with a lot of potential that has, you know, very historical culture, very wealthy. Its natural resources are vast and untapped in certain cases. This is a country that is, it actually started, although the system of governance was terrible, but it started on a path, and for some time, the country lived and developed. Looking at the infrastructure of Ethiopia currently. But under war, no infrastructure can be built. The little resources will be taken to the army and for buying weapons to kill your own citizens. That will not take any country anywhere. But I think the solution of this is for IGAD, for example, which is currently silent, and the Africa Union is rather silent on these issues. These are the organizations that, instead of waiting for UN to say something, but these institutions closer home are supposed to have actually helped the government to realize the problems this might create in the long term. And denying individuals or societies food because of war is actually a crime.
Thank you very much. I want to close this conversation with the last point you mentioned, that denying citizens access to food is a crime. And also you mentioned that a government that denies the existence of famine and human suffering, the tragedies of massacres here and there, and the famine, starvation that is going on in the country, would not succeed. And you both underlined that unless there is a possibility of peace, there is no any way that the states, particularly the Ethiopian government, would succeed in subjugating citizens for the sake of controlling and for the sake of consolidating political power. Thank you very much, Professor Gufu Oba and Dr. Gutu Olana. And on behalf of the Oromo Studies Association, I'm very delighted that thank you, and we will also keep in touch for another conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.